Hey everybody, welcome back to another reasonable price prediction, the series where we try to figure out where your favorite altcoins could be headed. Today we are back with Cardano, and as usual we're going to be comparing our previous predictions with how Cardano has currently been playing out. If you like the video, please leave a like. If you don't, leave a dislike too, that's totally fine. Getting straight into it, we can see that since April, Cardano has just been trading down, and we can see that we actually had quite a strong move back at the end of July that brought us above this resistance line that Cardano had been following all the way since March. It hadn't been able to break above, but we did break above it back at the end of July, and while we did move back down below that resistance, we have now once again broken up back above it. And even though we had a wick as low as 28 cents, current prices are a whole 10 cents above that. So even though the trend has remained the same, it has stayed bearish, there has been little bullish elements here and there that are reminiscent of the move that we saw back in October, November, December timeframes. Now, in the previous video, we compared what we saw here at the end of 2023 to the end of Q1 of 2024. We compared that move similar to what we got at the end of 2019 up to the end of Q1, Q2 of 2020. And we can see when we draw these circles and compare them, we can see the moves do look quite similar. We got our first move from the low, we move up to our first high, we have a retracement, we move up to a second high, while all of it happening over a similar time frame of 29 weeks back in 2019, and it happening over 26 weeks back in 2023. We then had a long sell-off period, which we've now fully realized, and back in 2020 or 2019, it took 25 weeks for this to play out. However, once again, this cycle, it seems to have taken less time, and so far we've spent 21 weeks trading down. Now, by no means does this have to be the low. We could very well go lower than 28 cents, or we could return to 28 cents. But for the time being, the model does seem to fit. And now if we are going to play out in a similar way to back in 2019, we could expect to see a rally at the end of the year, or once we've put in this low, whichever way you want to measure it from. Me personally, I think it could be both. There are a lot of indicators at the moment, especially if you want to look at things like the Ethereum Bitcoin charts, that indicate we could very well see a reversion anytime within the next few months. And it could be tomorrow. I have no real way of knowing. But in my opinion, I do think we will see some kind of a move to the upside, like we saw back in 2019, 2020, by the end of the year. So there's still good reason to believe that we could go lower. The reason I say that is just that we haven't started cutting rates yet. But if in America we do start to cut rates, I expect we'll start to see Bitcoin dominance shrink. It'll start to move down, and therefore Bitcoin altcoin pairs can start to rally. It kind of depends on when rate cuts arrive and how quickly the crypto market wants to respond to those rate cuts. Either way though, the charts currently do look eerily similar, especially as this orange circle that we've marked doesn't come down to the first initial low that we see with the green, and it's a very similar story here. And while the time frame is a little bit shorter, realistically a few weeks, in my opinion, isn't a good enough reason to disregard this comparison as being completely useless. Whether we see this blue rally up, I'm not sure. I mean, if we do take a look, we have had quite a few strong weeks recently, and even though we've had stronger bad weeks, that could very well change. And again, if we do potentially get a rate cut in September, we could see a very strong, immediate, positive reaction, and that could bring us up to this high, only for that hype to wear off and maybe we capitulate and put in a final lower low. That is definitely a scenario that could play out. In terms of tagging this trend line at 25 cents, this initial low that Cardano first came down to, I would lean more to the side of I think we'll come back to it. And before, perhaps I would have been a bit hesitant, a bit more reserved to say that, especially after this rally here and how we didn't trade down as quickly as I thought we would. I honestly thought we'd be much lower sooner, but I now have gone back to that just because we did see this dip down to 28 cents. That is basically 3 cents away. And even if it's not a weekly close, even if it's wick down or below, I do still think that we will see a 25 cent Cardano most likely by the end of the year. And if we continue to kind of keep these time frames lined up, we can see that back here this was 13 weeks, but as this cycle back in 2019 took longer to play out compared to this cycle, I've given this white period a bit of extra wiggle room, and with 17 weeks it would put us at the start of December. This is when this kind of final return to the low would be projected, if we are basically taking apples for apples what we got this last cycle back in 2019. So potentially, if we're going to see this model continue to play out as it has played out more or less to a T so far, we could see a return to 25 cents either from any time onwards now, basically, but most likely before the end of the year. We can see that this was only the weekly close as well that we got these returns. We actually wicked much lower back in 2019. So potentially, if we take kind of how far we moved down below this initial spot back in 2019, we moved down 30%. If you want to assume that we're not going to get as much volatility, you could say 20% of a wick down to 19 cent Cardano. If you want to take the full 30% of a move and say that we get a 30% wick below this 25 cent level, you're looking at a 17 cent Cardano, which would be its lowest price since basically the end of 2020. So not too bad to keep that in mind, in my opinion. Again, just kind of looking with the bull market support band, we can see that this orange circle here, we were well below the bull market support band. Another thing to notice is that we had a flip here with the EMA and the SMA, and that was a few weeks before we got this orange circle. Here, we can see we've just had that flip now. So potentially that could indicate that we will see lower lows, as we had this flip at relatively, well, not lows, basically. We got this flip on a green week, and the lows, after we got this flip, came 6 weeks afterwards. If we now go to where we are, we can see we did get this flip on a green week, and if we go 6 weeks out from this green week, that puts us at the end of September. And, you know, there's no guarantee that we do get this first low and then a rally up. We might just go straight down to this low. Just because the model has been bar for bar, more or less, so far, doesn't mean that it has to continue out that way. So we could just see a strong drop down to 25 cents. Ultimately, it's impossible to say at the moment, but just be aware that those are some very realistic possibilities. Looking at the Bitcoin chart with Cardano, last video we compared these two moves that Cardano had back in respectively 2019 and 2020, and I personally came to the conclusion that we looked a lot more like the 2020 rally and sell-off, but ultimately that there was a bit of both there. We also looked at the time after the halving it took for Cardano to bottom on the Bitcoin chart, and it does look like it's well on its way to doing that. We can see that if it is 32 weeks after the halving, like we saw back in 2020 when Cardano Bitcoin bottomed out, we could potentially be looking at a low of December for the Cardano Bitcoin pair, which again, like I said before, would be it wouldn't be well before the end of the year, but it would be before the end of the year, before 2025, that we get this low, and then we start to see strong bullish moves. We also looked at the 2019 sell-off and saw that it took 51 weeks for Cardano to put in its final low before getting a strong rally. And lo and behold, if we take it from this high and move 51 weeks out, it puts us at the exact same point. Both indicated to the beginning of December for when we would get Cardano's final low before seeing some kind of a strong movement. If we do get this low, and if we do move down to either this support at 440 sats or this low of a 68% drop, like we saw in the 2020 sell-off, we saw a 68% drop, we could potentially see Cardano go as low as 500 sats or 440. Personally, I think 500 sats will be reached, but whether we go lower than that, that's a much harder question to answer. Ultimately, I think both are possible, and potentially we might only get a wick down to a low of 440 sats. Maybe we might only go to 470. It's impossible to say, but I do think 500 sats is on the table. So assuming that we do reach 500 sats, how high up could we expect to rally? Well, last cycle, we got an 11x against Bitcoin. So if you're expecting a 3x from Bitcoin, you think it could reach 200k, you think it could reach 150k, you're expecting either a 30 or a 20x from Cardano, which is very bullish. And to be honest with you, in my opinion, a bit out of its ballpark. I would be more reserved, and I would be selling my Cardano at this point anyway. I would be expecting a 5x move against Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin gets a 2x, Cardano's getting a 10x. If Bitcoin gets a 3x, Cardano's getting a 15x. So if we get a 500% move against Bitcoin, where does that put Cardano? Well, on the Bitcoin chart, a 500x puts us basically at this resistance again, at 3,000 sats. I would be selling just before 3,000 sats. And on the US dollar chart, assuming that Cardano returns to that low of 25 cents that we talked about, and then gets that 15x rally, we're looking at a $3.75 Cardano, which I definitely wouldn't be scoffing at if you're buying it now at these prices of 38 cents. To be honest with you, I think now, while I have been saying over the last few years, and I made this YouTube channel over a year ago now, and ever since I've basically said, stay out of altcoins, they're gonna bleed against Bitcoin. I think now is the time to maybe start, if you're that way inclined, to maybe start moving Bitcoin into altcoins. Maybe not now, maybe you want to wait, maybe you want to see these charts revert a bit. That's what I'm going to do personally, but it could potentially pay off to start moving into these charts now, and you could potentially time the bottom pretty well. I would never suggest timing the bottom, I think it's impossible, but if you're putting a little bit in each week from this point onwards, I think you'll get some good prices. Anyway, I think I've spoken about most things I want to cover. One kind of dampener that I always point out, just because it is a good reality check, the 32 weeks after the halving, Cardano saw $32 billion of trade volume, 32 billion Cardanos worth of trading volume in that 32 weeks. Currently, while we haven't had 32 weeks, we're well over the halfway mark. Let me actually check how many weeks. We've had 18 weeks, so over the halfway mark, and we haven't broken 1 million ADA of trading volume yet. We're at 750 million, which is still a huge amount, but it does show that a lot of people are calling for ADA to blow past its all-time highs and go to crazy prices. But if there's no trading volume, if there's nobody using it, maybe that's a good thing if suddenly a huge amount of people flood in and start trading on these decentralized dexes. But just be aware that basically, whereas here, lots of people were trading Cardano and it went on to do this amazing high, there is currently a very small fraction of what we got here. So maybe you might expect a smaller move because of this. Either way, it's up to you to come up with your own conclusion on that. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike too. That is totally fine. Also, please consider subscribing. You can do that by clicking my face up here, and consider checking out the video that is recommended up here. Google thinks you want to watch it, so you should probably watch it. Thanks so much for watching till the end, guys. Take care and peace.